Well, hey there, Aletheia Church. Hope that you guys are doing well. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes recapping my sermon from James chapter 1 on Sunday that I had entitled Spiritual Wholeness. And I spent a little bit of time introducing what we would see in the book of James. And then I kind of worked into what James is talking about in those first 18 verses. And what I said was in verse 4, you see him say that you're brought to completeness or perfection. And so what we saw is this idea of as James is writing to these Christians who are have been displaced from Jerusalem and throughout Israel, and they're struggling quite a bit. And what he says to them is, hey, listen to what I'm about to say so that you might be brought to some place of spiritual wholeness or spiritual completeness. And we said that James was presenting to them three ways by which this happens. And really, the reality is it's done by one way, but there's two things attached to walking through that one way. And that one way is trials. He says that our trials produce in us or test us to produce steadfastness, and that steadfastness leads to being perfect and complete, lacking nothing. And so we talked about how trials do that, and you guys are going to spend time in your groups talking about that as well. But then we said that there were two kind of key things to work out and work through in living out and working out those trials. The first one was wisdom and seeking God for wisdom. We talked about how God gives wisdom generously. We talked about what godly wisdom was. We talked about how important it was, and then we talked about faith. And we talked about going to God in faith. And we talked about how that gets misconstrued a lot. So I hope you guys will talk about that in your groups. But also, we spent a decent amount of time talking about what it meant to be double-minded and how a lack of faith really, in reality, leads us to trust in the wisdom of God, but also mix in the wisdom of man. And that's what causes so many problems inside of the church, especially in the midst of trials. And then we finished up by just talking about how we know that we can live by faith in the midst of these trials, and that's because of Jesus, our crown of life, the one that we do all of this for. And what we saw was three kind of promises that James makes to these Christians about Jesus and who he is and why we can trust him. We saw that Jesus was sovereign. James called him the Father of lights. We saw that he is trustworthy because James says that there is no variation or shadow due to change in him. And then lastly, we saw that Jesus is generous. And we saw that James said that he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So we're going to be talking about a pretty difficult subject in your groups. I hope that you guys will kind of be honest about suffering and trials and difficulty, and that hopefully you'll be able to encourage one another as to how Jesus is the source of wisdom and hope, that you can, by faith, trust in him through that trial and learn on the back end what steadfastness kind of can produce in us. Because one of the beautiful things is being able to trust God when you face your next trial is such a gift and a blessing. So, church, I'm loving you guys so much. I'm praying for you, and I'm hoping that God uses this to be a springboard to a greater faith and worship of him. I'm praying for you. Have a great week. Go and be the church.